Hi, this is Greg. Look for my book, The Agile Brand, on Amazon or on my website at theagile.world. My name is Greg Kilstrom, and I'm the host of the Agile World podcast. I'm excited today to introduce this special episode brought to you by TEKsystems, an industry leader in full-stack technology services, talent services, and real-world application. Today, we're going to talk about a very important topic, Identity Access Management, or IAM, as we'll refer to it several times today. Identity is at the core of security. Organizations that can seamlessly manage and maintain user access to business information and data will not only decrease the likelihood of a breach, but they will also eliminate service disruption, establishing a competitive advantage over their less protected peers. In today's digital revolution, identity has never been more relevant and necessary. To help me discuss this topic, I'd like to welcome TEKsystems Risk and Security Practice Leader, Corey Patrick, to the show. First, why don't you tell me a little bit about what you do at TEKsystems?
Well, I lead the risk and security practice, which you did a great job of highlighting there. But what does that entail, right? And risk and security, those are very big words and very big topics, right? But really, to boil it down in a simplistic way, is we help our customers focus on security, privacy, and compliance from an outcome-based perspective. And so, when you think about professional services, our team is focused on driving outcomes for our customers more so than necessarily just filling a role or those types of things.
Great. So we're going to touch on a lot of different aspects of identity access management, but let's start with a definition of it first. Corey, why don't you do that for us?
Sure. In simplistic terms, identity is everyone has one, right? And we share that identity in multiple ways. But identity is the key for a human or a service or a computer to access particular types of information, right? And so when we talk about identity and access management or IAM, it's really about how we monitor, how we establish, how we protect, how we manipulate essentially identities in various ways, and in determining that the right person or process has access to what they're supposed to have access to and not what they're supposed to have access to, right?
Yeah. So let's talk about why this is so important for organizations. What's the main goal or business priority organizations are trying to achieve with their identity access management programs?
Well, you'll hear it manifest itself in a lot of different ways, right? Anytime we sit down and talk about identity with an organization, they may be focused on increasing the user experience, right? You may hear stories, and oftentimes we hear customers say, it takes a new hire 7 days before they get all the access that they need when they start work, right? And when you think about that, it's daunting. Imagine starting a new job at a new company, and you're going to be nervous no matter what, even if you're comfortable and excited and all those things. And when you start a new job, you want to make an impact, and you want to show that the company made the right decision, right? Like, you hired me, and I'm going to hit it running day one, right? And imagine not having access for like 7 days, right? And so when you think about the user experience, that is oftentimes a huge driver in an organization saying, hey, we have to do something about identity. But reality is, it comes back to what I threw out kind of in the intro there is we need to secure data. We need to ensure that our data is secure, that the right people have access to it at the right times. And now with the evolution of privacy and how prevalent that is in the world that we live in today, it becomes even more apparent, because it's not just about securing that data. It's ensuring that the right people have right access to particular pieces of that data. So it's not just a big story anymore. It's trying to lock down individual chapters or maybe even pages or words on a page. And that is what it really makes IAM or identity just that much more complex.
Yeah. So how is success measured then in these programs?
Well, success can be measured in a number of ways, right? And you have to look at it in a number of ways. It's not simple. It's not simple enough to say, "Hey, we didn't have any breaches, so we must be good," right?
All right.
And I think that's partially where information technology or IT departments struggle in defining the value back to the business. And in reality is, identity is a function of the entire organization. Security, privacy, compliance are functions of the entire organization. And in a lot of companies, the responsibility for that falls back on IT versus having IT be a component of the larger picture, right? So there's just as much of a mind shift in how you manage expectations, how you measure success. But I would measure success in a function of time, right? If it takes us this amount of time to do something today, and we can now shorten that time in the future, the degree of which we shorten that time is a measure of success, right?
Yeah.
Like from my example earlier, if it takes a new hire 7 days before they have all the access they need, and now they have all the access they need the morning that they get there, that's a game changer.
Well, so a follow-up question to that. I mean, so you mentioned, and I completely agree, that IT is brought into this, but they are a piece of identity. You mentioned onboarding a couple of times, for instance. So I do a fair amount of work in employee experience. How often are you seeing HR, for instance, involved in this process of identity management, or is that a gap where you see there's a lot of room to grow?
From an HR perspective, right? HR should be the driver of many of these things because in an organization, it typically starts with HR where an identity is born, right? Yeah. And so whatever HR system that you're using, and there's a multitude of HR systems out there, but whatever HR system you're using, that's when the person is born, right? And oftentimes in the IAM world, you'll hear birthright provisioning. When you think about birthright provisioning, it's automated process that flows through everything in the organization. And so that really does stem from an HR function. And so HR is the center of the universe when an organization says, hey, we need to get serious about identity. And when that's a focal point, and oftentimes that's a challenge, right? Because depending on the mindset of your organization and how aligned information technology is to the business, you may not have the right thought process around, that person may not realize that. So this is just as much a marketing campaign in an organization. And that's why I talk about the user experience, right? Because the user experience and identity is incredibly powerful because it affects everyone, whether it's the end user or the individual, but also that particular business unit as well. So IAM is really an opportunity for an organization to make some of those huge changes in mindset and culture and saying, hey, security and privacy and compliance, those are all functions of the organization. And those things should all be aligned to business functions, not just an IT process.
Yeah, completely agree. So as a leader in the IAM space, TEKsystems has insights into trends shaping IAM. Let's talk a little bit about that now. How do you see the identity access management market evolving, and what business technologies are driving change in this space?
I think there's a number of things. I think the fundamentals of identity management, or just identity in general, I don't think those things have changed a whole lot, right? How we look at it or the importance of it has changed dramatically, and you will always want to look at the cloud and say that the cloud is driving this change, and in some ways it is. But it's not necessarily because of the new technologies or new capabilities afforded to us by the cloud. I would actually argue that it is some of the things that are being taken away from us by the cloud. Because an organization that has traditionally operated on-prem, per se, either in their own data center or in their own facility or even leveraging maybe a co-located location for data, they've always had control of the perimeter and they've had a defined perimeter. And so a lot of organizations that have maybe struggled with identity in the past have compensated for that because they control the infrastructure, or they have a very strong perimeter, or they have monitoring capabilities, or some things in place from a physical control standpoint that have, in a way, compensated for an immature identity program. Yeah. When you move into the cloud, you lose all of that. You lose control over the infrastructure, you lose control over the perimeter, you lose control over many of those things that you once took for granted, right? And so the only thing that you have left is identity. And so that is really driving, in my opinion, the focal point for change and why this has become such a hot topic. It's not because it's evolved necessarily in some way, shape, or form, even though it has from a technological perspective. It's evolved in the sense that, hey, it's the last thing that we have control over.
So how do market expectations match maturity of different IAM technologies?
So I think there's two important differentiators, right? Identity and access management is a process, first and foremost, right? So it's a process that your organization uses. And then there's also tooling to help execute that process. And where some organizations have a challenge, and it depends on really your organizational culture, is are we a tool-centric organization or are we a process-centric organization? And when you see process-centric organizations, a lot of times they struggle in scale because what may have worked from a provisioning standpoint, when you were 20 employees, doesn't work when you're 500 or 5,000 employees. And they often take that very same process and try to scale it by just throwing more people at it, right? And that proves really to be not effective, right? So you have an organizational culture in say, organization A, where they don't think they're a big company, but they are because they came from a small company roots. And then, or you have what you see maybe in some of the more enterprise and larger corporations that you have today that are really put together. There are a lot of smaller corporations, right? They grew through acquisition, they grew through merger, they grew through those types of things. And now you have a lot of different processes, different technologies in place. And how do we tie all that together? Or how do we change a culture in only one part of the organization? And for many organizations, that's a huge challenge and not something really at either end of the spectrum that an organization can typically take on alone.
Yeah. So I guess follow up to that, for that organization that is, let's say they're either they've acquired a lot of companies or they've, just acquired something recently. Does TEKsystems work with companies like that? And, how would you where do you start with that?
We work with both.
Okay.
And the reality is you start in the same place and looking at your processes, right? And like the small organization example that I provided earlier, well, it's looking at their process and understanding what their strategy is, right? Because a process is really a strategy. And then what ways can we change the execution of that, either through the evolution of tools or through the evolution of refining a process, or oftentimes both, right? Because a tool should be the tactical execution of that strategy.
Yeah.
And the tools may change over time. And the way that we use the tools or the capabilities of the tools over time is going to change. But that strategy is largely going to remain resilient. And then, so there's that aspect of it. The other aspect is looking at the process, right? You have a large enterprise that has a lot of tools and different processes in place, and it goes, take a step back, look at the process again. What are we trying to accomplish? What are our business drivers? How are we aligned to the business in this process? And then refining and streamlining those processes, and oftentimes helping broker compromise, right? Like, this company or unit did something this way. Let's bring a best practice from that side of the organization. Let's bring another best practice from the other side of the organization and kind of meld those things together so that the overall change isn't impactful on one side or another, right? This is as much about winning hearts and minds and the user experience as it is anything else, right? And oftentimes being a third party or an independent third party can help be that impetus to change, right? Much like my children, they listen to other adults better than they listen to me. And so it's oftentimes leveraging that capability or that third party to help drive that change.
Yeah, definitely. So let's talk a little bit about implementation.
Sure.
So you kind of touched on that, but let's go a little deeper and what it's like to implement and maintain identity access management. So what best practices would you say most broadly apply to your customers and really anyone working with IAM?
Best practices, that phrase is one of my favorite phrases in the consulting world, and it's not because I love the phrase. It's because it's a phrase that has a lot of different meanings, right? And when you break down even the term best practices, it's really about what worked somewhere else. And just because something worked somewhere else doesn't mean it's going to work in your organization. And so the challenge in that space and areas that we often find ourselves helping is taking, okay, that worked somewhere else, but understanding the culture, the fiscal constraints, and even the political constraints that an organization may have, and adapting those things into that organization, right? Yeah. Because change is hard. Even if it's good change, it's still difficult because people are outside their comfort zone. And so how do we alleviate as much of that change as possible, alleviate as much of that anxiety, and bring forward things that actually work in that organization? Well, a little bit of that is on us or that third party, because we need to get to our organization. We need to get to know our customers. We need to understand, end to end what our folks are dealing with and what some of their challenges are so that we can adapt those and model those, right? Yeah. So when you think about best practices in that sense, it's always about starting with the process, right? It's looking at what is our strategy and what is it we're trying to accomplish.
So it's kind of along those lines, but as organizations progress, what challenges do they often face in maintaining those, whether it's those processes or even the original strategy, and how do you work with customers to really make sure they're adjusting over time and maintaining the overall strategy?
Sure. Well, identity is a journey, right? And first of all, if we look at it as a program or a journey, it's something that lasts a long time. And the length of the organization or the life cycle of the organization is really how long that identity journey lasts, right? Now, there might be a series of projects, and there should be a series of projects within that journey to enable those things. But ensuring that IAM isn't looked at in an organization as just a project, is like something that we're going to do and then we're going to be done with. That's the first thing. That's really the first thing that we need to overcome. The second thing is organizations sometimes become enamored by shiny objects, and we all do, right? And so we see a demo or we see a particular tool, and that we see a demo that suggests that maybe it'll solve all of our problems, right? Before we've even developed the requirements or really defined what our challenges really are. And so what we often see in this space is an organization that may have, picked a tool before really defining what that strategy or what that process is behind it, or defining what their business requirements in a really detailed way, need to be. And one of the areas that we can help is helping to define those requirements and sitting down with those business units, whether it be IT or whether it be other units within the organization, and really bring together what those requirements are and doing it in a detailed way, and then helping that organization find the right tool or tools to tactically execute on that strategy. Most organizations make it too complicated. They take a manual process or something that a human does today and try to replicate that through automation, rather than potentially refining that process and leveraging the tool. So organizations that have oftentimes gone down the tool route, and if you hear an organization say, hey, this tool is not what we thought it was, or this technology isn't working for us, really when you get down to the root cause analysis of it, it's we've configured it to replicate a manual process, or we've over customized, or we've over engineered, or we've done a whole bunch of things that now make the product or the process unsustainable, right? Because when you think about just software in general, it doesn't matter if it's an identity and access management tool or an operating system. Something that is overly customized now cannot be updated. It cannot be maintained. It cannot be sustained without a overwhelming amount of expense, right? And then it becomes a program that isn't sustainable because you're not going to be able to budget that year over year. You want to reduce cost. Everything that we do from a technology perspective, we want to try to streamline processes and reduce cost and time over time. And so the onset, you've now defeated that. So that's always the big challenge is keeping it simple, keeping it sustainable, and ensuring that you have the right resources in the organization to actually maintain the program, not just complete the project.
Yeah. So where does IAM fit in when an organization's talking about digital transformation? And certainly there's a lot of privacy concerns there. Where does generally speaking, where is it in the consideration of overall transformation, and what should organizations keep in mind in regards to privacy when they're talking about these digital transformation projects?
So I spent a number of years in the federal government investigating computer intrusions. So our perspective and the perspective of my team often comes from what would an adversary do, right? And whether that's a nation state actor, whether that's a financially motivated actor, whether that's a ideologically motivated actor, or even an insider threat, right? And insider threats come in a lot of different ways too, either witting or unwitting, right? Regardless of the threat, identity is the holy grail of any adversary, because most organizations struggle with detecting the malicious use of identity. If I can get a hold of legitimate credentials as an adversary, I own the kingdom. And I have a lot of time before most organizations would detect that I'm using those things maliciously, right? So when you bring that back into digital transformation and you bring that back into concerns beyond security, such as privacy and compliance, being able to control access at a very, very granular level, whether that's a document or even a page within a document in some cases, that becomes paramount, right?
Yeah.
And if you don't have the right processes in place and you don't understand your data, you don't understand how the classification of your data, you don't understand where your data is stored, but most importantly, you have to understand how your data is used by the business and how it flows and moves back and forth within the business. And it becomes more of a behavioral exercise as much as anything. You have to know how your business behaves. You have to know how your business leverages the infrastructure to be able to detect anomalies. And that's different per se than maybe some of the more traditional security processes out there where we're taking known bad and trying to overlay that across our business, right? A lot of what happens from an identity perspective today isn't always detectable by traditional indicators or tools. It's more behavioral monitoring. And as you think about the technology that is coming out today, and you're really seeing a convergence, and I'm probably leading into another question here, but when you see the convergence of technology within identity, the products are becoming more and more uniform in what they do and what they tackle.
Yeah. So yeah, let's talk a little bit. You mentioned a little bit before about moving to the cloud, some differences there. What are some of the considerations that an organization needs to take if they're going to either implement on-prem versus in the cloud? Is the trend moving towards the cloud? Are there what are the considerations there?
Most organizations are going to have a hybrid strategy. They're going to have some things that they do on-prem. They're going to have some things that they consume in the cloud, whether that's infrastructure that the company sets up in the cloud or whether it's software as a service that they're consuming. Many of your traditional partners from like a service desk perspective or, even Active Directory or your traditional email and document programs, all of those have moved really into a software as a service model within the cloud. So whether an organization has a cloud strategy or not, if they're using products such as Office 365 or, ServiceNow or different tools such as that, you're in the cloud, whether you want to be or not. And so most organizations are challenged in that way in the sense of, well, how do we do identity? And it's because they probably struggled with identity even in a complete on-premise environment. And it comes back to some of the things that we talked about earlier when it said, well, when you have a robust perimeter or you have other compensating controls in place, you can account for an immature identity program. But if you are moving into the cloud and your program is immature, then you're just moving those challenges into the cloud and you're probably having less visibility into those things than you did before, right? Yeah. Which creates additional vulnerabilities and opportunities for various types of adversaries to compromise your data.
Yeah. So before we wrap up this episode, what tips or recommendations do you have for companies as they evaluate or evolve or even expand their existing IAM programs?
Well, first and foremost, and it kind of ties into everything that we've talked about, is define what we're trying to solve, right? Whether that's through user experience, whether that's through enabling the business, but really the organization understanding, all right, what problem are we trying to solve? Because there's probably a multitude of challenges. There's probably a multitude of processes that need improvement. There's a multitude of technologies and those sorts of things that either are in place or could be in place. And that can be overwhelming. And so biting off one thing at a time or a few things at a time rather than trying to solve every problem that you have at once, even the ones you don't have. Yeah. It sounds simple, but in practicality, we see it. We see it often. So keep it simple, keep it sustainable, tackle one problem, right? This is a marathon, not a sprint. Putting one foot in front of the other, you're going to eventually get where you're going. And as long as you maintain that and keep that, that's a positive thing. I would say, secondly, define your business requirements. This is not just a IT or technology function. It's a business function. And how does identity and the granularity and the way that you control and understand access in your organization, well, that impacts compliance from especially a privacy perspective, as that becomes more and more paramount. From a security perspective, because you understand your data, you know where your data is, you know how your data moves across the organization. Identity can be the key to really everything that you do from a security, privacy, and compliance perspective. And then thirdly, define your processes. Understand how you do business. And that comes back to the requirements piece as well. But you really want to take the time to define your processes and don't be afraid to change or adapt those things.
Well, thanks so much for joining the show. Again, I'd like to thank Corey Patrick of TEKsystems. To hear more from Corey, his security peers, and IDC, visit TEKsystems.com, where they just released a publication about IAM. It's called Version Next Now. Be sure to check it out. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and found it helpful, please rate the show on iTunes or contact me through my website at theagile.world. You can find my books, The Agile Brand and The Agile Web, on Amazon and on my website at theagile.world.